Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to beat the Imperial Guard as the Eldar. So a lot of you guys have reached out to me with this question before, not only in this edition, but in last edition as well, and that is simply due to the fact that Imperial Guard happened to be one of those odd matchups for the Eldar. And in a lot of past editions, the Imperial Guard were actually counted among one of the factions that was straight up a counter to ours. In 5th edition, Imperial Guard countered Eldar pretty much in every way. They had superior indirect fire, and they had superior numbers and firepower. So there was very little a Crawford Eldar player could do in that edition to, really truly best a good, effective Imperial Guard commander. And even though our faction is much stronger now, in fact, we are the strongest faction right now in the meta, Imperial Guard can still give players trouble, especially those who aren't prepared for the matchup, simply because Imperial Guard works so much differently than a lot of other factions in the game, especially the ones where you're, obviously most prepared to see, which is Space Marines. So as somebody who has played as the Imperial Guard and against the Imperial Guard for many years, I can tell you for a fact that with a little bit of knowledge, the matchup will be a lot easier and a lot less intimidating. Okay, so what are we looking at in this video? Well, we're going to be taking a look at the Imperial Guard army rules, detachment bonuses, and key stratagems. Now, I know they're technically called the Astra Millitarum, but I come from a background where we just called them the Imperial Guard. So I will be probably referring to them as that for the rest of this video. Just keep in mind, every time I say that, I am referring to, of course, the Astra Millitarum. We're also going to be looking at the most common IG units and their counters, and a few tips and tricks to beating the Imperial Guard, and just what to expect in general when going to battle against them. Okay, so first I do want to mention the elephant in the room, right? The thing that all of you are probably thinking about. How do I deal with Imperial Guard? They trade better, they have cheaper units, right? My fragile Eldar units just don't trade well with them. They're very inexpensive, and, they have a bunch of indirect fire, which is the weakness of the Eldar, right? So how do I beat the Imperial Guard as an Eldar player? So it is true, IG are tough for the Eldar because a lot of their units are cheaper than ours and can thus trade more efficiently. They also have some of the best indirect fire in the game, which is a big problem for our fast yet fragile units. And also they are vastly superior in the primary objective game, being able to consistently flood objectives with high OC units. Again, their guardsmen are all OC too. And they are very plentiful. You can expect an average Imperial Guard army to have upwards to 100 infantry models in their list, and that's not even scratching the surface. They can obviously go much harder than that. And I've even seen lists with upward to 300 to 400 Imperial Guard units in the past. And I think even in this edition, you could probably easily get up to 300 or 400 infantry models in your list. So yeah, that is going to be tough for an Eldar player to handle because currently a lot of the meta revolves around tough vehicles and things like that. So having to deal with a lot of cheap yet fairly durable for the cost infantry is something that Eldar are sometimes not equipped to handle with the current lists that we're bringing. But I will say, even though the Imperial Guard do have a lot of strengths that they can leverage against us, they also have a couple of key weaknesses that we can take advantage of, which we will explore later in this video. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the IG army rules, detachment bonus, and key stratagems because, like every good autarch, you need to know your enemy before going into battle. Starting off with their army rule, it's voice of command. So this basically is orders, right? Imperial Guard officers can issue orders to Imperial Guard units. These automatically pass. Unlike in past editions where you had to roll a leadership check, they just automatically go off. So it's good to think of these as short-range psychic powers. I know that seems kind of weird, but they're basically psychic powers that automatically go off. And of course, any officer can issue them to the selected unit. All right. So officers can issue a number of orders listed on their datasheet to specified units within 6 inches with the regiment or squadron keywords. So officers will be, either regiment or squadron. And in some cases, they have both, like Leontis, who can issue orders to both regiment and squadron units, which is why he's such a popular pick in Imperial Guard armies. Now, I don't specifically go over him in this video, but I will be talking about him throughout the video as well. So even though he doesn't get his own special spotlight, we will cover him and we will cover models like Ursula Creed. And units can normally only be affected by a single order at a time. So there are exceptions. Kasserkin can be, affected by 2 orders. Ursula's unit can be affected by 2 orders, but normally a unit can only be affected by 1 order at a time. So Imperial Guard commanders have to choose which one best suits the situation. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the orders they have access to. The first one is pretty straightforward, move, move, move. It just adds 3 inches to the movement characteristic of models in the unit. This is a very good order for getting models into position quickly. It is not uncommon for an Imperial Guard player to be able to get onto objectives on turn 1 with a unit of Catachans and basically just prevent you from getting to that area of the board. It is an extremely effective objective-based order that you will see throughout the game when you're facing the Imperial Guard, so you should be prepared for that. And what I like to do to kind of prepare for this is I just assume that everything in my opponent's army has an extra 3 inches of movement, and that way you won't be caught off guard by this. Fixed bayonets is going to give them +1 to their weapon skill and melee. Now, I say +1 to hit on my slide here, but the truth is that it gives them +1 weapon skill. So this can stack on hit modifiers. So that is important to note that, sometimes Imperial Guard will be hitting on a 2+ against you, and that can seem really weird for the unprepared. Take aim gives them +1 to hit at range, which is essentially the same thing. It's +1 ballistic skill, so it can stack with hit modifiers. And the Imperial Guard do have a bunch of things that help them hit more accurately. So this is the order you're going to see probably 9 times out of 10 on every turn. They also have first rank fire, second rank fire. This increases rapid fire by 1. You're not going to see this on any unit except for maybe Kasserkin's or in some situations, Ursula's unit. All right. You're just really not going to see that much because it's not a great order, but it can multiply damage if you're, able to benefit from more than 1 order. As typically, mathematically speaking, just having +1 to hit or +1 ballistic skill is going to be better than this 9 times out of 10. Take cover increases the save by 1, and just to let you guys know, it's not the benefit of cover. It's +1 to your save, so it does work in combat, and it does stack with cover. So that means that Imperial Guard units can actually be quite a bit tankier than you would expect. And lastly, they have duty and honor, which improves leadership and OC by 1 for each model in the unit. So this is a very niche order, but if you are trying to force objective control on an opponent, like you're trying to use Storm Guardians to, hold down an objective from the Imperial Guard, or you're trying to take an objective away from them, they can use this and simply just out-OC you, and you're going to be out of luck. And pretty much access to this order means that you're going to have to kill the unit to be able to out-OC them, because even 5 models with 2 OC apiece can easily out-OC a lot of units in our index. All right, so their detachment bonus is Born Soldiers. This is what they had last edition, except it's a little bit weaker because now, instead of just getting lethal hits on everything at all times, they only get lethal hits when they remain stationary. It is a good ability in theory, but won't often be able to be activated because units are going to be needing to move constantly in order to score on objectives. So oftentimes you will just not see this except for on artillery units and units that are, basically going to be sitting on objectives and don't plan on moving. As for their stratagems, their key stratagem and the stratagem that their whole army revolves around is reinforcements. So what is reinforcements? So when a unit dies in their army that has the regiment keyword, they can return it to play. Basically, the unit is wiped out, but you can return an exact copy of the unit to reserves, and that unit comes in on the board during your next turn. Now, it is important to note that although the Imperial Guard squad will get all of these special weapons and things like that it was equipped with, it will not be able to bring back officers. So Ursula Creed, Leontis, the Death Corps Marshal, all of those characters are not going to be able to be brought back when the unit is destroyed. So there is a point to destroying those units if you can, because those characters will not be able to return. However, there are going to be situations where this simply will not matter. Either the unit is not going to have important characters in it, or the unit's not going to have characters at all, like in the case of sentinels, which can be taken in units of 3 and can be targeted with the reinforcement stratagem. And lastly, there is one final point to make about the stratagem, and that is that if you are able to kill multiple Imperial Guard units within a single turn, Because remember, this is a strategic ploy, so there's not much that you can do to activate this a second time in any given turn. Most likely, you're going to be able to use it once per round, and that's it. As the maximum number of command points that you're going to be able to get is going to only be 3. So you can only really use this once per round. So that means if you are able to kill more than one infantry unit, so more than one regiment unit in one turn, those units are not going to be able to come back. So if you're able to kill 2 infantry units that have the regiment keyword, one of those will never be able to come back. That is going to be permanently destroyed. So if you are going to go after those regimental units, make sure that you're able to kill at least 2 of them so you can keep up the pressure on your opponent and they're just not bringing back their infantry that you've just killed. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the next stratagem, which is Fields of Fire. Now, unlike reinforcements, this is a battle tactics stratagem, so Ursula's ability will be able to reduce this to 0 command points for her own unit, which is usually why you see her unit take a mortar. So what does this actually do? So basically what you do is you target one regiment or squadron unit from your army that has not been selected to shoot this phase. Usually it's going to be Ursula's unit because of the aforementioned ability, so that of course you can use this with other stratagems. So basically what it does is after your unit resolves its attacks against its target, you select, one enemy unit that was targeted by one or more of those attacks. It's going to be pretty much just one unit most of the time. And until the end of the phase, each time an attack is made against that enemy by a regiment or squadron model, unless the attacking unit's battle shocked, you improve the armor penetration characteristic of that attack by 1. So essentially, it's -1 AP for every single squadron or regiment unit, which is going to be the vast majority of your opponent's army. So this is a very strong ability, and it's very good at damage stacking. The Imperial Guard have a lot of damage stacking mechanics with their officers and, of course, their units. So this is one of them, right? Now, this would be bad enough on its own because this is a pretty powerful ability for getting rid of things like Death Stars, right? Your Wraith Guard blobs or your Avatar of Cain. But this actually stacks with another ability that is often seen in Imperial Guard armies as well, which is the Leman Russ Exterminator. So the Leman Russ Exterminator has an ability where it basically does the same thing. If it hits an enemy units targeting that unit also get -1 AP on their weapons, which allows for some really insane damage against tough targets. Your Avatar of Cain, your Wraith Guard blob that you move to the center of the battlefield are not going to survive. And yes, they do survive against most armies, but not against the Imperial Guard because of all these damage stacking abilities. So do watch out for this in the first couple of turns of the game when your opponent has a lot of units on the board. It may be wise to hang back a turn and just wait a little bit so that your Wraith Guard unit or Avatar of Cain don't become easy target practice. The next stratagem is called Armored Might, and Armored Might is another 2 command point stratagem, so you'll notice a little bit of a pattern here. A lot of these are very powerful, but they're also very expensive command point wise. Imperial Guard do have a lot of ways to regenerate command points, and they have an ability, of course, from Leontis to just gain a command point, just like our autarchs. But the issue with them is they're still only going to have 3 command points per round, so they can't really use reinforcements and Armored Might in the same turn typically. And that's something you can definitely capitalize on. And what I like to do against Imperial Guard is I like to stretch the resources as thin as possible. I like to target their vehicles and infantry in the same turn so that they have to choose, do I want to go with my reinforcements or do I want to go with Armored Might? 9 times out of 10, they're going to choose the reinforcements, which means your Bright Lances are going to be a little bit more efficient into their tanks. So what does Armored Might do, though? Because it is a very powerful stratagem, and it essentially gives -1 damage to the tank. So this is really powerful on things like the Rogal Dorn, right? The Rogal Dorn has 18 wounds, and we're going to be talking about the Rogal Dorn in just a second. But it's very strong, very durable against our weapons. Bright Lances wounded on 4s. Yes, you do get the reroll, but that's still iffy. Wounding something on 4s is 50-50. So even though Bright Lances are still good against it, if not only do you have to wound on 4s, but you're also going up against possibly it being in cover, which it probably will be in cover. Let's be real here. And you're also, taking into account the Rogal Dorn's ability once per game to reduce damage to 0, 2 or 3 Warwalkers can all of a sudden look to be pretty pathetic against it, especially with the Armored Might ability, right? The Armored Might stratagem. So you do have to watch out for that, as it significantly increases the durability of Imperial Guard tanks. However, just to let you guys know, it does have diminished returns against high-powered weapons like Bright Lances and Fusion Guns if you are able to roll high on the damage itself. So a couple of Bright Lances going through, doing 8 damage apiece. Maybe you get lucky and roll a 6 on one of the damage, and then on one of them you use a Fate dice to get another 6. That is going to be pretty much an almost dead Rogal Dorn. You will probably need to clean up those couple of extra wounds with something else on the board, but it is going to severely reduce the effectiveness of this stratagem. And again, like I said, if they're using Armored Might, they're not using reinforcements unless they have banked that from previous turns. So just to reiterate, with the Imperial Guard stratagems, you do really want to keep that pressure on your opponent so that they're always basically choosing between reinforcements and Armored Might. You don't want to give them an easy choice to where they're either just going to 100% go for Armored Might because you're not targeting their infantry, or they're 100% going with reinforcements because you're not targeting their vehicles. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the most common IG units and their counters. So these are the units you will probably see in pretty much almost every Imperial Guard matchup, and that is the Basilisk, the Manticore, Leman Russ battle tanks, Guard infantry, Scout and Armored Sentinels, Gaunts Ghosts, the Rogal Dorn, and of course, Scions and Kasserkin. So let's talk about my favorite vehicle in the Imperial Guard motor pool, and that is, of course, the Basilisk. The Basilisk was the first tank I ever got when I was a kid, and I have to say it is still holding a special place in my heart to this day. The Basilisk is a long-range indirect fire weapon with D6 plus 3 attacks at strength 8, AP minus 2, and damage 2. It also has blast. This makes it extremely good against infantry targets, especially mech targets. Its ability also makes infantry units that are hit minus 2 movement and have minus 2 on their advance and charge rolls, so kind of similar to the Night Spinner, except that it only affects infantry. And of course, instead of just preventing advances, it just does minus 2 to advances. However, the Basilisk is not very durable. It is toughness 9. It's just as squishy as our Eldar grab tanks, even squishier actually, because it only has 11 wounds, but it is great at slowing units like Wraithguard from getting onto objectives early. And especially if they're able to get there first with a unit of Catachans, that unit of Wraithguard is going to be caught out and probably going to just be trying to fight against Catachans for that objective. And I guarantee you, each and every time, the Catachans are going to hold that for at least a couple of turns before you can regain control. All right, so what are the counters to this? So the biggest counter to units like the Basilisk and, of course, the Manticore, which we'll talk about in a second, is the Crimson Hunter. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. The Crimson Hunter sucks, blah, blah, blah. But the Crimson Hunter is actually a very good tech into Imperial Guard. If you're expecting to have trouble into Imperial Guard when you're, entering into a tournament or something like that, a Crimson Hunter is not a bad option. Yes, it is very squishy, but it gets a lot more value when you can pair it with something, especially if you can pair it with things like the Yinkarn that can just jump in there right after you kill the Basilisk or Manticore and wreck everything else around it. And your Imperial Guard opponent is probably going to have to pop smoke to try to avoid this, and even then, sometimes it's just not going to be enough, and you're going to be able to kill that Basilisk and wreck his backline. The Night Spinner is also very good in trios. So if you have a trio of Night Spinners, you can basically kill a Basilisk per turn, which is what a lot of Eldar players have done against vehicles like this. Because with Twin Linked, you can just go for those devastating wounds. And, the Basilisk only has 11 wounds, which makes it vulnerable to triple Spinner. And typically, Basilisks are not good into Night Spinners, so Basilisks don't trade well with Night Spinners because their Strength 8 has trouble getting through Toughness 9 of the Night Spinner, so you're probably not going to have to worry about them being effective against you in return. Reserve D-Cannons are also very good and can make short work of it as well with Fate Dice support. So if you have a couple of D-Cannons coming into reserve, even just one of them is capable of killing a Basilisk pretty easily with the support of Fate Dice. And if they do choose to pop smoke, you probably want to use the Fate Dice to ensure hits, as you will most likely wound both of those attacks. So if you come in, on average, you're going to get 2 attacks with it. You can use a Fate Dice to make sure that one hits. Your other attack is probably with smoke going to hit on 4s. And then, of course, if you do hit both of them, you can pretty much easily kill it as it only has 11 wounds. All right, so next up is the Manticore. So the Manticore is very similar to the Basilisk. It's just as squishy, but it is more expensive. It does have a higher strength of 10 and damage 3, which makes it much better against our grav tanks. So unlike the Basilisk, this thing actually can kill grav tanks pretty easily when you have a couple of them in tow. It can also reroll hit rolls against units with 5 or more models, making it a bit more accurate. But here's the thing, it's not that much more accurate. And this usually just equates to 1 or 2 more hits because you are hitting on 4+ with this thing. So yeah, the rerolls are good and stuff. It's much better against bigger units though, because you can leverage that blast more. And like I said before, it has the same low durability as the Basilisk. So its counters are basically the same as the Basilisk. The Crimson Hunter basically can one-shot it when it comes in. Night Spinner spam can of course take these guys out 1 a turn, although the Manticores are better at taking out Night Spinners as well. So if you don't get the first turn and you're going up against something like Triple Manticore, you might lose a Night Spinner around, so do be careful about that. And reserved D-cannons also work very well. Now, probably the most iconic Imperial Guard battle tank is the Leman Russ battle tank of all variants. Now, why do I say all variants? Well, simply put, because most of the variants are useful. There's a couple of them that are not so good, but your normal Leman Russ battle tank is pretty solid, your Demolisher is pretty solid, and of course your Exterminator is often seen in every Imperial Guard list for its -1 AP ability. They're extremely tough at toughness 11 with a 2+ save and 13 wounds, making them slightly tougher than Wraith Lords, and they have fantastic damage as well that can hit hard against most targets in our army. They can take things like multi-meltas and last cannons on the side sponsons and the whole sponson weapon, so they're packing a lot of heat. And of course, the turret weapon is very powerful also. Typically speaking, if a Leman Russ is able to draw a bead to any of your units, expect that unit to die a horrible death. So what are its counters? So obviously, Bright Lances do very well against them in general. They have strength 12, so they wound on 3s, and will trade up on average rolls, whether you're talking about a Falcon or a Hornet or a Warwalker. You should be able to kill a Leman Russ with about 3 Bright Lances on average. Now, of course, your opponent could also be benefiting from cover and things like this, which is why I do like the Viper. I think the Viper is a good inclusion against Imperial Guard if you're thinking you're going to have trouble against the matchup, just because they do have a 2+ save, which gives them a 5+ save against Bright Lances. If they're in cover, it's going to be a 4+, which is a much better armor save that you don't want them to have. So having a Viper being able to remove that cover save is a good way around that durability. Because realistically, all you need is 2 Bright Lances to get through against a Leman Russ battle tank to be able to kill it, right? The Vipers might not, but it's going to remove the cover save, and then your Warwalker can follow up and put 2 Bright Lances through its hull and destroy it. Fire Dragons out of a Falcon absolutely shred them as well, especially since Fire Dragons are able to get into angles that, a Leman Russ battle tank might not have a cover save against, and they have a higher AP value. Yes, they do wound on 5s, but you're getting those rerolls to wound from coming out of the Falcon, and the Fire Dragon Exarch has a Fire Pike, which is strength 12, which will wound on 3s. So you just need a couple of those to get through. You boost one with the Fate Dice, and you can almost guarantee that Leman Russ battle tank is going to be scrap. All right, so let's talk about Guard Infantry. So when I say Guard Infantry, I'm basically referring to all the different Guard Infantry types. There's no one counter to any type, but I will talk specifically about Death Corps in just a second and what weapons are good against them versus what weapons are good against your regular, Catachans or Cadians. So they come in 4 varieties. You have the Catachans, Cadians, Death Corps of Krieg, and of course the regular infantry squad. So these are cheap. They have fantastic objective control, especially if you choose to include a regimental command unit and give them the regimental standard. So, with the order, each model is like at 4 OC. So you basically have to kill the whole unit to take objectives from them. They have great board presence because they are cheap. They can be fielded in large numbers. And their damage can get quite decent with orders. So don't underestimate strength 3 lasguns, especially as an Eldar player. They are wounding us on 4s, which isn't bad odds. Catachans do get a scout move of 6 inches and have flamers. Acadians have sticky objectives, which is really good for, securing your backline and then moving forward. Death Corps hit harder when damaged and are tougher. So they do come with the meta pack and they get Feel No Pain with the Marshal. And if you stack those with Take Cover, they can be quite resilient against anti-infantry weaponry. However, because Feel No Pain is a lot less efficient on 1 wound models against damage 2 and up weapons, Shuriken Cannons are particularly effective against Death Corps of Krieg, whereas against other, infantry units, they wouldn't be as efficient. Lastly, infantry squads come with heavy weapons, and they also have the benefit of cover when controlling objectives, so this is mostly a camping unit. You'll probably see this unit on the home objective, guarding it against enemies and screening out opponents from reserve. And overall, though, Guard are very expendable, and that's exactly how your opponent is going to use them. These are not units to be protected, particularly. They're units that are going to be going on to objectives and taking the brunt of enemy attacks. So what are the counters to Guard infantry? Well, precision attacks can take out officers, reducing the combat effectiveness of the unit. So most of the officers in the Imperial Guard have 4 wounds with a maximum toughness of 3 and a 5+ save, which is slightly worse than Eldar characters. So Eldar characters are very squishy, and they're notoriously squishy, of course, but Imperial Guard officers are even slightly squishier than that. So with your Ranger units and your Shroud Runner units, look for opportunities to take out the officers leading their squads. If they don't have officers, oftentimes their orders aren't going to be as plentiful. They might not be able to order everything in the area. And also, on top of that, they're not going to be able to have those extra benefits for damage. Rangers and other infiltrators can also screen them from getting onto objectives early in the game. This is what the Guard infantry does best. And that is simply getting onto objectives and being able to stay there long enough to score on primaries, forcing your opponent to interact with them in a less than favorable way. So preventing them from getting onto the objectives in the first place with infiltrating abilities is very effective. So to give you a quick example and rundown of how this would work, you would infiltrate just outside of 9 inches with a unit of Rangers. You would make sure that you're just outside of that 9 inches in front of an infantry unit. And that way, when they use move, move, move and advance, they often cannot actually get to the objectives in the midboard. So yes, they will be close to the objectives in the midboard, but they will not be close enough to consolidate into them, and therefore you will have prevented them from getting onto that objective and solidifying that position. Yes, they don't start scoring primaries until the second turn, but if your opponent goes first and you're not in a position to stop them from getting on those objectives, most likely that Imperial Guard squad will be able to survive until they can actually score on primaries during their second turn. If you get first turn, you can move the Rangers up as close to the enemy infantry unit as possible and then block them from moving even further. So yes, that Ranger unit will most likely die, but your opponent is going to lose on some primary points. And this can also work equally well with Sentinels, especially the Scout variant, who are going to be able to get their Scout move. You can deny them their Scout move, and you can also, of course, deny them that ability to get onto an objective early in the game. And you're also able to block advance moves. So you kind of hem your opponent in their deployment zone in the first couple of turns, and this can give you that early board control advantage. Shadow Spectres absolutely annihilate them. So Shadow Spectres are your bread and butter for killing these guys. And I've done the math a couple of times in past videos, especially my Aspect Warrior video where I do cover Shadow Spectres. They can dish out an insane amount of attacks against Imperial Guard infantry. Typically, the first time you go up against an infantry squad that is not a reinforcement unit, you are going to be going against a full unit of 25. 5 Shadow Spectres shooting a unit of 25 is 5d6 plus 25 attacks. So just put that into perspective for a second, right? On average, you are going to get about 42 attacks against a full unit of guardsmen. You throw Guide on there from a Farseer Skyrunner, and all of a sudden you are hitting an insane amount of times against them, and you are wounding on 3+. Now, yes, they might have take cover, they might have the benefit of cover as well, but you're at AP -1. So most likely they are going to be on a 4+ save. So that is a lot of wounds going through, and most likely you will be able to wipe the unit if you throw a buff of guide on your Shadow Spectres. However, there will be a few left at the end of it, right? Because obviously they do have a 4+ save. A 4+ save does save about 50% of the unit. So there might be a couple left at the end of your shooting phase, which is good. You don't want to kill all of the guardsmen if you can help it. A couple of guardsmen left, unless they're on an objective and they're going to score next turn, can't reinforce. So you need to destroy the entire unit to be able to target them with the reinforcement stratagem. And because they're not a full unit, or they're not fully wiped out, I should say, they're not going to be able to use the stratagem, and then you can wipe them out in the next turn. However, do be careful with this, right? You don't want to always do this, because if the enemy is on an objective that you cannot contest from them, then, you don't want to just give them free primary points. You do want to annihilate the unit. Yes, they will come back as reinforcements, but you are denying them precious primary victory points. So try to use your best judgment on that. Basically, rule of thumb, if they're on an objective controlling it, try to annihilate the unit. If they're not on an objective, try to leave a couple left so that they can't use reinforcements. All right, so next up is the Scout and Armored Sentinels. So these are probably some of my favorite Imperial Guard models. I've always liked Sentinels. I think they act the most quote-unquote Eldar out of probably all the models in the Imperial Guard Index. So I have a soft spot for them. Now, as far as their gameplay goes in 10th edition, Scout Sentinels are very good at getting to objectives early and marking a target for boosted accuracy, either rerolls of 1s to hit, or they basically allow an indirect fire unit to ignore the -1 hit penalty for indirect fire, which is good as well, right? You can pair these guys with some basilisks and you can get some solid damage out of them. Armored Sentinels are fantastic vehicle and monster hunters. They get to reroll wounds against them, so you give them hunter-killer missiles, and of course you're going to have hunter-killer missiles on every single Imperial Guard vehicle because they're all free now, of course, with free war gear. So they actually make very good vehicle and monster killers for the points. 3 of them is about 110 points though, so it is a pricey investment. However, both Sentinel units have the regiment keyword, so can of course be reinforced. However, they are fairly easy to kill, and they're typically armed with las cannons or plasma cannons. So they're mostly going to be good against your heavier targets, right? Your grav tanks and your wraith lords and stuff like that. They're really not going to be that efficient into things like infantry. And although they can engage you in close combat, they're not particularly going to do a lot of damage in close combat. They're mainly there for disruption. So Imperial Guard players, if you let them, will scout move. They will move these guys forward, and then they will charge into your units and gum you up in your own deployment zone. So the same tactic I told you about before with infantry squads is a tactic you want to apply to Scout Sentinels as well. So just like the guard squads, you want to be able to use infiltrators to prevent them from getting onto objectives early and denying good firing lanes. Any anti-large tech melts them quickly as well. But do watch out, they can reinforce due to the regiment keyword. So Fire Dragons, very effective against these guys. Bright Lances, very effective against these guys. Pulse Lasers, very effective against these guys. Basically, any anti-large or light anti-large is going to be effective against Sentinels. The only thing that's not going to be efficient into Sentinels is Shuriken Cannons. So Shuriken Cannons are just, they're not that great against Sentinels. They wound on 5s. They only have AP -1. Even Scout Sentinels have a 3-up save. So you're not going to be doing a lot of damage there. And these guys have an awkward 7 wounds. So damage 2 weapons and damage 3 weapons are a little bit awkward into them. You'll need a little bit more firepower from something else to be able to kill them. And in general, that's why I prefer Bright Lances or Pulse Lasers to do the job. However, if you are bringing Eldar Missile Launchers are another good tool. Okay, so now we have Gaunts Ghosts. So Gaunts Ghosts is basically a very hard unit to deal with for an inexperienced player. And an experienced guard player, a veteran of the game, will be able to abuse this unit to its absolute maximum. Gaunts Ghosts are great anti-infantry at both range and melee. They have good ranged weapons against Eldar because it's strength 3, but it has some AP. And their melee is very strong against light infantry like Eldar. It's strength 3 weapons, but they have fights first. They can sky leap just like Swooping Hawks and can jump around the board scoring objectives. They also have lone operative, stealth, Infiltrate, like I said before, fights first, and they always get the benefit of cover. Now, also, these guys have 2 wounds apiece. They're not like your average guardsmen. They are very tough, and they will take more firepower to be able to deal with. So, how do we deal with such an annoying unit? Well, believe it or not, the Eldar actually have some pretty good answers to this unit that other factions just don't. Shuriken cannons absolutely wreck them, and we have a lot of fast-moving units that can get within their lone op range and wipe them out. I had a Death Jester one game, 1 round the entire unit. So yeah, Death Jesters are actually very good against these guys. And I'm telling you, do not be afraid to put the Death Jester in a position where you can move into their lone op range in the next turn and shoot them to death. If you get that lucky 50% chance, 12 shots out of the Death Jester with the Fate's Messenger combo, you will most likely 1 round the unit. And guys, I'm not even kidding about this. The Death Jester can do some serious work against them, but also just regular Shuriken cannons can do the job as well. I've had a Wave Serpent before move into their lone op range, fire some Shuriken cannons, take out half the unit, use its ability, take out another ghost, and then charge them and finish them off with a nice little tank shock. And the good news is just like Skyleap, if they are engaged in close combat, they cannot use Skyleap. So there is that. So the Wave Serpent is a good tool, but basically anything with Shuriken cannons can do the job, even something as simple as a unit of 3 Wind Riders with Shuriken cannons. They don't really do well against tough targets either, as all of their attacks are low strength. So that Wave Serpent I mentioned is good, but also Wraith Lords are very good against them as well and can screen them efficiently. Having a Wraith Lord in one of the corners of the battlefield just to make sure that they don't pop up to score secondary objectives is a very good tactic to deny them those extra points. Also, just basically screen them out with things with solid torrent overwatch. Warp Spiders and Wraith Lords can zone them very well. Because they have Flamers, they're not going to really want to get too close, right? Flamers do ignore cover, so the Wraith Lord's Flamers will just erase that benefit of cover that they have. However, even though Warp Spiders don't naturally ignore cover, they have devastating wounds, and they do wound these guys on 3s with some pretty powerful overwatch. So if you position your Warp Spiders correctly, and they're still alive by, turn 2 or 3, in which the Gaunts ghosts are going to be, popping up everywhere around the board, then your opponent is going to have to, select their position a little bit more carefully. So now we come to the heavy hitter of the Imperial Guard. It used to be the Leman Russ battle tank, but no more. It is now the Rogal Dorn. So the Rogal Dorn is an extremely tough tank with massive firepower. It's toughness 12 with 18 wounds, basically making it a mini super heavy, and can ignore 1 damage roll per game, which, by the way, is a very strong ability on something that is already extremely tough. So what are the counters to this absolutely massive tank? Well, luckily it's very expensive, and therefore things like fire prisms actually do very well into it, right? Fire prisms are not good against a lot of things out there point for point nowadays. You don't see them as much in lists anymore just because they are rather expensive, but they absolutely tear it apart. So try baiting it out first with a weaker unit, maybe throw a Warwalker out there, shoot it at a Leman Russ battle tank, bait out the Dorn, and then annihilate it with fire prisms. If that is, you're still running a pair of prisms. D-cannons from reserve are also a great tool as well, and 2 of them can bring it down pretty effectively. They do wound it on 3+, and with fate dice you can bring it down with average rolls. Fire dragons and a falcon still wreck it on average dice, despite its increased durability. To survive, it would really need to use smokescreen and or armored might. And again, if they used reinforcements, they cannot also use armored might in the same shooting phase. They're just not going to have the command points unless they really saved up those command points. So by putting pressure on your opponent at all times, from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, you can prevent this kind of thing from happening. Okay, moving on to a unit that you guys might also see very commonly in Imperial Guard lists, and that is the Scions and the Kasrkins. More importantly, the Scions this edition are a little bit more popular for objectives and things like that because of their deep strike. So both of these units are accurate and have reliable damage against infantry with powerful special weapons. So, not so much against your marine equivalents typically for the points, just because of the fact that they do have strength 3. But against Eldar, they are very efficient and cost effective because, Eldar units are a little bit more expensive. Like I said before, Scions have deep strike, but Kasrkins do not. Kasrkins typically need to be in a transport. Scions reroll 1s to hit or all hits against enemies on objectives, which makes them very efficient. And Kasrkins get to benefit from an additional order. Most of the time, their additional order is going to be take aim and first rank fire, second rank fire. So what are the counters to these units? So primarily, I've seen these guys as objective-based units. I've seen them in units of 5, or the Kasrkins being used as basically a bomb to drop out of a transport. They are pretty squishy for the points, and typically normal anti-infantry weapons deal with them pretty effectively. A unit of 5 warp spiders will wipe the unit with Overwatch on average rolls. So if your opponent is trying to deep strike scions in, a unit of 5 warp spiders covering your backline or covering things like your Autarch Wayleaper that might be on an objective or things like that can be a very good way of preventing your opponent from, just killing that Wayleaper or forcing the Wayleaper to use Phantasm and things like that. Screening them out of deep strike is also effective, as is Phantasm for moving out of line of sight behind or around ruins when applicable. And this is really good with lone operatives, but it's also useful on things without lone op like Farseer Skyrunners and regular Farseers. What you could do is you could simply block line of sight by moving around the ruins with Phantasm and thus eliminating the chance that the Scions can pop your Phoenix Gem. And this is important because I've seen it many a time. Imperial Guard players are not afraid to charge their Scions in after Deep Strike. Yes, typically, Scions won't have the raw power to deal with a lot of our melee-based units or strike-first units like the Autarch Wayleaper, but they will have the power to take out a Farseer pretty easily. After all, Scions do have 2 attacks apiece base at strength 3, and the leader can be armed with a Power Fist, and they are rerolling 1s to hit even if you're not on an objective, and that doesn't just apply to their ranged weapons, it also applies to their melee attacks. So yes, a unit of 5 Scions will charge into your Farseer on foot and will probably kill it. So the Phoenix Gem is not going to protect him, so you might as well Phantasm around that ruin, block line of sight, and save your Farseer's ass. Alright, so now that we've gone over the main guard units that you will see and will probably give you trouble, here's a few tips and tricks to beating the Imperial Guard gameplay-wise. So first of all, do not be afraid of the artillery, and that's the first thing I hear from players all the time. How do I deal with the massive amount of indirect fire? Its bark is often worse than its bite in 10th edition. In past editions, this was truly a terror. In this edition, it is not so much. Guard artillery is expensive, and 2 basilisks under the effects of orders will get an average of 4 kills against a Shadow Spectre unit, leaving 1 to still score on secondaries. So, 2 basilisks is 270 points worth of models, only able to kill about roughly 80 points worth of models themselves in a shooting phase. Which, don't get me wrong, is good, but it's not the most efficient firepower. And typically, even though most Imperial Guard players will have a couple of basilisks, they're going to be using them more for the ability and a lot less for the actual raw damage that they put out. Reserves are also your best friend, as not only does it protect your damage dealers, but it also allows you to set up screening opportunities for reinforcements. So being able to come in on the side of the board actually denies a pretty big area from your opponent to where he can bring in his own reinforcements. So, obviously do look out for opportunities like that where you can come into reserve, kill something, get a good angle on one of your opponent's units, but at the same time deny them from actually moving onto that area of the board themselves. The other thing you want to do against Imperial Guard is force them to make hard choices about which stratagems they want to use. I kind of touched on this a little bit here and there throughout the video, but you only get 3 command points per round, and the 3 best ones that Imperial Guard have all cost 2 CP each. One of them can be free, which is Fields of Fire with Ursula Creed, but that's about it, right? You can't use Armored Might and reinforcements in the same shooting phase. So by constantly putting pressure on your opponent, you are denying them the ability to combine those stratagems together to stop you from pulling off any kind of devastating shooting rounds or, devastating turns. Screen their infantry as well off of objectives and deny them good firing lanes early in the game. You do not want to let a guard player set up on you. That is a recipe for disaster because their units, again, can come back and can trade more efficiently than your units can because of reinforcements. Also, be sure not to overcommit. The Imperial Guard have tools to counterattack hard. Select key targets, eliminate those key targets, then duck behind cover. Typically, you want to aim to kill one vehicle and perhaps 2 units of infantry in a single turn. Now, I know a lot of Eldar armies out there are just bright lances, but you guys kind of have to adapt because that meta is changing, and as we've seen in recent tournament results, other types of lists are finding a lot of success. And I have to say, infantry is finding their way into the competitive scene more and more. So you can't just spam a bunch of bright lances in your army and take a bunch of war walkers and hornets. You do need to branch out a little bit and, also take into consideration that you will need some anti-infantry tools in your list. And again, you should be able to kill about 2 regiment units per turn, whether they be a unit of sentinels or a couple of units of infantry. And lastly, force your opponent to move by securing key positions on the battlefield. Not only does it lower the guard's lethality, but it will expose their more valuable units to your very efficient and deadly shooting. Okay, so I do want to make a quick note though on IG skew or meme lists, because this is something that has come up in the Discord. How do you deal with an all infantry list? How do you deal with an all tanks list if you don't have the firepower to necessarily deal with either? So this is something you see a lot on Imperial Guard channels on YouTube. Morty and Glory did some great videos on this where he has, kind of meme lists or skew lists that he brings to tournaments and things like that. And between being a very good player and his opponents not maybe expecting to see that much infantry or that many vehicles, he often does very well in these competitive settings. So when going up against these types of lists, you have to use your less useful units for disruption and objectives instead. Your warwalkers are never going to be able to kill their points worth of guard infantry, so you might as well not even try. Use them for disruption and use them for objective play. And to give you an example of how you would use warwalkers in this situation, they do have Scout 9, so you can use them to secure objectives and screen out opponents. You can charge them into guard infantry squads. Yes, they will probably die, but it's going to be a huge inconvenience to that guard blob, and they're not going to be able to get on the objectives as quickly. And also, units like rangers and stuff like that can screen as well to support that kind of game plan. Likewise, if going up against an armored column, use infantry to move block and tie up vehicles in combat so they cannot get to objectives. So if you're going against a list that's just all tanks, the main weakness of that list is going to be controlling primary objectives. So if you can stop them from getting onto those primaries, just like the infantry list, you can do very well in that game and you can outscore your opponent, even if you are not able to actually kill all of their tanks. And again, you probably won't be able to kill 12, 13 vehicles in a single game. It's just not really that possible with a lot of lists, right? But you can use your elements that aren't going to be effective against those Imperial Guard tanks in ways that they were not normally designed to do, right? So something I love doing against armored columns and lists with lots of vehicles is I like charging my rangers into combat. And this is really hilarious because it basically means that my opponent's tanks cannot move on their first turn. So they can't get to good firing positions. They can't get to objectives properly. And oftentimes they're just going to be kind of stuck there in their own deployment zone. Now, something I want to mention really quick before I forget also is that Imperial Guard tanks can take heavy flamers. So even though it's not popular in my local area to take heavy flamers, most of my opponents take the heavy bolters. There is a good chance that your local meta will be more heavy flamer centric. If you are finding yourself going against a lot of heavy flamers on tanks, you might want to be more careful with where you place your infantry. And yeah, you might not want to charge that unit of rangers into combat. But even so, you might still be able to move block them and prevent them from at least moving onto objectives on turn 1. So in conclusion, Imperial Guard can be a tough challenge, especially as a newer player, and they key in on a lot of Eldar weaknesses, and an experienced IG player will know these weaknesses very well and will be able to leverage them to their advantage in game. To beat them, it really requires you to consistently put pressure on their units, as well as have good screening and careful trading tactics. IG can be a very strong army with an experienced commander, but they're not impossible to defeat. And actually, I've had some of the funnest games that I've ever played against Imperial Guard. Imperial Guard are just fun to play against, I know it may seem intimidating that they have all the indirect fire and things like that, but very rarely are you going to see an experienced Imperial Guard player in 10th edition run more than 3 pieces of artillery. it's just not very cost effective, right? Now, one thing you might see that I kind of failed to mention earlier, but one thing you might see a lot is Lord Solar Leontis. And a lot of you guys might be asking me, Proxy Hammer, how do you counter Lord Solar? He has 8 wounds. I can't really kill him with precision strikes or anything like that. And the answer to that question is simply, you don't. And I know that that's not the answer a lot of you guys were looking for, but Lord Solar is a support piece, right? He's not a damage dealer. He's going to be giving out 3 orders a turn. He's going to be giving you a command point, and he's going to allow you to redeploy a couple of your units in the beginning of the game. He's an absolutely great model, don't get me wrong, but there's more important things to deal with, and very rarely will you get the opportunity in-game to actually kill him efficiently without expending a huge amount of resources. And again, at that point, you're playing to the guard player's strengths. Now, there is a single counter that exists for Lord Solar, which I want to mention right now, and that is your old friend the Solitaire out of a Falcon. I've done this one time, and after that, I have not been able to do it because my opponent was more careful with where he placed Lord Solar, and he was able to kind of, position him out of line of sight and things like that. Because, by the way, even if you have precision strikes, if you don't have line of sight to your target, you cannot make attacks against that model, even in close combat, which I think is kind of dumb personally, but it is what it is, right? So if you have the opportunity, the Solitaire can basically one-round him pretty easily on a blitz turn, especially if you're coming out of a Falcon. But other than that, other than the Solitaire, there's really no good answer to it. So you're better off just ignoring him, focusing on the infantry, focusing on the tanks, and work on destroying the units that Lord Solar is buffing so that Lord Solar can't buff those units anymore. And really what it comes down to is Lord Solar is not very good in combat by himself. He's not a great shooter, right? I mean, I think he has a pistol that's decent at killing Marines. I think he can kill like 1 Marine on average a turn or something like that. And his close combat is okay, but he's nothing special. He's really a support character, and that's really where his strengths lie. Alright everybody, thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments if I forgot anything in this video. I think there's a lot of nuance to Guard, and Guard are a very diverse army with a lot of different units. So if I did forget a unit or something like that and you want to ask me a question in the comments, feel free to. I'd be really happy to respond to any of your questions asking for advice or tips against the Imperial Guard. And again, I have a soft spot for them. They were my first army, but I have to say, I like the Eldar a lot more. So let me know in the comments if you do have those questions. And once again, I would like to thank my patrons for their support over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped to grow significantly. If you do want to become a Patreon member and help support the channel, I have free trials activated, and a free trial will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, who are a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who like talking about strategies, tactics, and of course, hobbying. If you are interested in joining the Discord community and chilling with me every once in a while, definitely sign up for that free trial. And again, it's totally free. You don't have to pay a thing. You just have to sign up for a free trial. And it's just basically to screen out all the bots and trolls from getting in there and ruining things. We have well over 100 members and are looking to expand even further. So definitely check us out if you get the chance. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon or some discounted Eldar apparel, that's right, it is at a discount during Christmas time. If you guys want to grab some Eldar apparel to rep your local game store, I will leave the links for those in the description also. Alright everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one everybody. Peace out.